If we talk about the Second World War, and we mention the capture of thousands of people because of their nationality and ideology, to later be executed in cold blood for being incorrigible, what is the first thing that comes to mind? You are probably thinking of the Nazi German regime led by Adolf Hitler and its infamous attempt at ethnic cleansing under the Third Reich. However, not all the massacres in this war were perpetrated by the Nazis, and in general, a lot was done to hide them, or at least to keep the responsibility of the country that carried them out for decades a secret. An example of this was the Katyn massacre, which occurred between April and May 1940 at the hands of a nation that, at that time, was an ally of Germany. We refer to the Soviet Union, guilty of the mass murder of at least 22,000 people, and which only revealed and acknowledged its guilt for this crime in 1990 after 45 years of holding Germany responsible for these events. But what exactly happened in Katyn Forest? What led the Soviets to systematically shoot so many people? And what impact did this have when the Soviet Union switched sides and became part of the Allies? You'll find the answers to all these questions in the next few minutes. So make yourself comfortable and join us to learn more about one of the greatest Soviet massacres of World War II. Are you ready? Then prepare to travel back in time. On August 23, 1939, 9 days before the start of World War II, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression treaty between the two nations in Moscow. It was also known as the German-Soviet Pact, or the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which refers to the surnames of the foreign ministers of those countries. This was followed by the German-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Demarcation, and later by Stalin's request to join the Axis in 1940. One of the most direct consequences of this was the designation of Poland as a zone of influence, to be distributed among the signatory countries. Thus, Germany made sure that it could invade that territory without any fear of Soviet intervention. The Red Army did not condemn the Nazi outpost. Moreover, after the German invasion on September 1, 1939, the Soviets did the same, an event that started the Second World War. Consequently, while the Germans began a massacre of Jews and Poles in the western half of Poland, the Red Army captured thousands of Poles in the eastern region, both military and civil, placing them in various prison camps within the Soviet Union. However, this punishment would not be enough. A few months later, the head of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, abbreviated NKVD and forerunner of the KGB, Commissioner Lavrentiy Beria personally presented Stalin a plan to exterminate Poles. This was quickly approved by the leader of the Soviet Union, so much so that on March 5, 1940, Beria sent a top-secret letter to his subordinates ordering that the supreme punishment be applied, the death penalty by shooting to Polish prisoners, calling them permanent and incorrigible enemies of Soviet power. Of course, the NKVD troops did not take long to comply with the orders. During the spring of that year, just a month after the letter was mailed, the Katyn massacre occurred. This name comes from the homonymous forest in which the events took place, although the homicides perpetrated simultaneously in other nearby places are also taken into account, such as the Kalinin and Kharkov prisons, among others. It is estimated that the total victims of the massacre were at least 22,000 Polish citizens. About 8,000 of them were military prisoners of war. Another 6,000 were police officers, and the rest were civilians. The latter, members of the Polish intelligentsia, such as teachers, artists, researchers, historians, politicians, lawyers, engineers, scientists, writers, and journalists, all accused of being saboteurs, spies, or counter-revolutionaries opponents of the Soviet regime. Specifically, of the approximately 22,000 prisoners, 7,305 came from camps in what is now Belarus and Ukraine, 6,311 from Ostashkov, 3,820 from Starobelsk, and 4,421 from Kozielsk. The latter were those executed in Katyn, and only 448 were amnestied, saving themselves from extermination. The transfer to the forest was carried out in trucks, with 10 prisoners per vehicle. One by one, handcuffed, they were placed in front of a huge pit, then were shot to the head and fell directly into their own grave. This meant, in just a few months, the extermination of the entire Polish elite and great intellectual values. There are even those who claim that there are still undiscovered pits. Interestingly, the executions were carried out with German-made Walter pistols delivered to the Red Army during the invasion of Poland. The Walters, coincidentally, were the statutory weapon of the Gestapo, making it clear that the Soviets, from the beginning, took all possible precautions to hide their responsibility, as if they knew what was coming. The first alarm was probably raised when the Polish general, Władysław Anders, began to form an army after the Soviet Union changed sides in the conflict. When requesting that the approximately 15,000 military prisoners of war captured by the Soviets be transferred to his command, the answer was that nothing was known about them because they had escaped to Manchuria in December 1941. Nothing more was known about it until the 13th, April 1943, when the Germans themselves publicly announced the discovery of several mass graves with thousands of bodies of Polish officers and civilians. In fact, the Nazis reported that according to their records, the bodies belonged to prisoners who had been under the power of the Soviet Union. Faced with these accusations, and during the decades that followed, the Soviets flatly denied any kind of responsibility and claimed that the real culprits had been the Germans. They also refused to cooperate in the investigations. Meanwhile, even a delegation from the International Red Cross corroborated, during those years, the veracity of what the Germans were saying. And it did so even under the alleged pressure of the British and American governments not to investigate the subject too much. After all, it was not in the interest of the Western Allies to antagonize the Soviet Union. As President Roosevelt said in a telegram to Churchill in June 1943, "Winning the war is the primary objective for all of us. This unity is necessary." Of course, the situation was exploited by Joseph Goebbels through propaganda to divide the Allies and deepen popular anti-Bolshevik sentiment. He would even brag about it in his personal journal. After the conflict ended, in 1952, the United States formed a special committee to study what was already known as the Katyn massacre. The investigation ultimately determined Soviet responsibility. However, it was not very clear about the US pressure to hide the fact years before. The Soviets, for their part, went on with their active denial of the massacre until 1988, when Moscow began to hint that events might have been different from their version. Finally, in 1990, the Soviet Politburo approved the publication of the documents relating to the Katyn massacre, accepting its obvious responsibility, although without officially acknowledging it. And surprisingly, in 2005, the Russian Military Prosecutor's Office claimed that the massacre was not a genocide, but rather a prescribed military crime. The Polish people, even today, continue to demand justice. And now, we ask you, do you think that Russia should officially acknowledge its responsibility?
The Americans arrived on April 29, 1945, during the end of the evacuations from the camp. While advancing towards one of the darkest places in occupied Europe, they came across a transport with 4,000 prisoners, which they failed to intercept in time, and which continued towards Germany. After this incident, the Americans decided to pick up the pace. The 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions covered 60 kilometers along the Danube, arriving much earlier than Hitler's troops expected. It was Sunday noon, the camp was completely quiet, and the SS guards were on duty, monitoring the movements of the prisoners still in the camp from their towers. A heartrending cry broke the calm of the day. The Americans! The Americans! A prisoner ran towards the door, in a vain attempt to attract the attention of the soldiers, but one of the guards shot him in the back, killing him instantly. Either way, it wasn't necessary. The US infantry had caught sight of the Dachau towers, and began firing at the German officers. The SS members, finding themselves vastly outnumbered, decided to step down from their posts and surrender unconditionally. After the first two guards knelt, an American soldier approached and, without a second thought, executed them on the spot using his pistol. Thus would begin a bloody day, remembered as one of the greatest war crimes of the United States during World War II. Join us in a new episode of Military History to learn all about the terrible Dachau massacre, when American soldiers mercilessly murdered German prisoners of war. But before continuing, we want to introduce you to our new channel, Military Might. Here we'll explore the extraordinary world of the armed forces, armored vehicles, weapons of mass destruction, and the most important military conflicts of today. You'll find the link to subscribe in the description of the video and in the first comment. Are you ready? Let's get started. Captain Wilsey believed he was prepared for anything. He was part of the 7th Army of the United States, and had even participated in the landing in Normandy. As an anesthesiologist, a fundamental part of the medical corps, he witnessed the harshest images of the battle. Since entering Europe, he had assisted thousands of fallen soldiers, with the most terrible injuries, although most of them died clinging to the anesthesiologist's hand, while feeling the warm embrace of morphine as the last relief. Captain Wilsey believed that he was prepared for anything, that he had already seen the greatest atrocities of the war, until he entered Dachau. As soon as he passed through the barred portals that separated barbarism from the rest of the world, he could not help but remain motionless while he traversed the sinister panorama. Piles of skeletal corpses, a mixture of death caused by malnutrition with long exposure to the elements and the sun during decomposition. Piles of shoes and prisoner uniforms accumulated in sheds, which had just been removed from those sentenced to death, to be reused in the next litter of inmates who entered the camp. The ovens where they burned the bodies of the victims and removed the evidence of the genocide smoked at full speed. But even worse was with the living. The remaining prisoners, more than 30,000 people who were in subhuman conditions, looked like the walking dead. Completely devastated by starvation and lack of water, toothless due to poor sanitation and lack of personal hygiene rooms. Wilsey, like his American colleagues, could not really understand how such a scenario could possibly exist anywhere in the world. Somehow, the captain understood what his companions did the days following April 29, 1945, although the whole situation left him with serious psychological consequences that accompanied him for the rest of his days. But thanks to him, today we know the details of what is known as the Dachau massacre. The massacre began, as we mentioned before, with the first guards who surrendered in the face of the arrival of the 2 battalions of U.S. infantry. But this had been an isolated incident, until the Americans finally entered the camp. Tower B, the second lookout post, was also the scene of a systematic shooting of German guards who, after surrendering, were forced to kneel and shot in the head. Lieutenant Walsh captured 4 German soldiers, forced them into a freight car containing some 120 Jewish corpses, and, after keeping them there for a while, murdered them in cold blood. Some 12 POWs were later gunned down in a coal yard by a 19-year-old gunner, who was found by Colonel Sparks in deep shock, crying and screaming that they had tried to escape. Before the end of the first day, madness gripped the men at Dachau. After a long time, towards the end of his life, Wilsey attributed the macabre events to a kind of delirium tremens. According to him, the horrors that the American soldiers had to witness, added to the stress of the war, were too much for them. On the morning of the second day, the Americans forced some 50 SS soldiers to strip naked in the open and give the Nazi salute, arm raised to the sun, while buckets of ice water were thrown at them. This practice had been carried out by the guards themselves with the Jews and other prisoners previously. However, there was the condition that if they lowered their arms for whatever reason, they would be executed. The 50 Germans were shot to death before noon. In letters from the date of the events, the anesthesiologist spoke of the massacre as something logical. In one of his letters you can read, "I saw how my companions captured an SS soldier who had been tortured and then coldly shot him. God forgive me, but I watched it without being disturbed by emotion after knowing the actions that the beasts of the SS had carried out against their prisoners." Really, he wasn't the only one who had this in mind. Some members of the 7th Army of the United States, invoking a certain spirit of revenge, decided to give their rifles to the Jews in better health, so that they could guard the German prisoners in the way they saw fit. The men, who had been dehumanized, abused, tortured and humiliated for so long, soon unleashed a small carnage. They entered the camp hospital, where they murdered dozens of SS officers, as well as conventional German troops. They also directed their hatred against the capos, other prisoners who had higher status and wielded the power of guards among the prisoners themselves. Many of them were beaten to death or executed in the barracks. Within days, the Dachau massacre had been consummated. Although the official figures, accepted by the United States government, suggest that the German prisoners killed were between 50 and 100, some other sources indicate that they could have reached more than 500. General Eisenhower celebrated the liberation of the camp and reported that 32,000 prisoners had been released, while U.S. troops had killed some 300 enemies. The conditions in which these deaths occurred, however, became known almost 70 years later. And now, after going through all the details about the Dachau massacre, we want to know your opinion. Do you think that the actions of the American soldiers were justified by the brutalities they had to witness, or was this a war crime? March 2, 1943. In the sky, a fight between Japanese and American aircraft breaks out. At sea, 6,900 Japanese soldiers watch the aircraft fight from a convoy that is supposed to take them to La, New Guinea, to continue the fight in the Pacific. Japanese soldiers watch the showdown in awe, knowing they may soon find themselves at the mercy of enemy bombers and ultimately suffer the consequences of their country's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. A few minutes later, a second set of American planes is flying at high speed but low, opening the way with their machine guns and moving directly towards them. At that moment, the Japanese soldiers understood that their fate was cast and they prepared themselves for the impact of the bombs. From the beginning, the Japanese generals were aware that this was too risky a mission, but they still decided to move forward in the hope that Allied tactics would continue to fail as they had been doing. However, that day things were radically different and what started as a simple risk mission turned into a real massacre. Don't leave your screen, because in the next few minutes we'll tell you what happened in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, and how the Allies changed their tactics to achieve such a precise and deadly blow. Following the pivotal American victory at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the Allies launched an ambitious offensive to seize the Pacific. They first attacked Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The campaign lasted months, but in December of that same year, the Japanese generals realized that they had no possibility of holding those territories anymore, so they had to focus their efforts to resist in New Guinea. Mainly, they had to strengthen the city of La, to the east of the oceanic country, facing the Solomon Islands. To fulfill this task, on January 5, 1943, a Japanese convoy made up of 5 destroyer ships and 5 troop transports moved from Rabaul to reach La. However, they were intercepted and attacked by aircraft from the United States and Australia, which left a balance of 69 Japanese aircraft and 1 ship sunk. Despite the attack, the Japanese need to reinforce the La troops was great, so they immediately began planning a similar mission for the beginning of March. Due to the Allied power in the area, the plan was extremely risky, with only a 50% chance of success. The other option was to mobilize troops from Madon, which involved a 230-kilometer journey through inhospitable swamps, mountains and jungles. Finally, the Japanese generals went ahead with the convoy plan, ignoring the great danger. The Allies quickly detected Japanese preparations and, through intercepted and decoded messages, accessed tentative dates of enemy movement. Preparations also began on the other side. One of the great challenges for the United States was to improve the effectiveness of airstrikes. These were very common to intercept the Japanese supply line, but in the January convoy raid the techniques had proven not to be effective enough to sink enemy ships. To improve the result, the air forces adopted new tactics. The biggest difference was that they would approach the target at a low altitude, head straight for it, and drop the bombs from that position so they crashed into the side of the ship, instead of dropping them from above. This would give their enemies less of a chance to intercept them and react. For a few days, they trained with the remains of the SS Pruth, an ocean liner that ran aground in 1923. At the same time, the various bombers were modified to add machine guns in order to neutralize the anti-aircraft artillery of the target ships. Finally, March 2nd arrived. The Japanese convoy, made up of 8 destroyers, 8 troop carriers and an escort of 100 fighters, had left Rabaul a couple of days earlier, but had gone undetected due to 2 tropical storms that made it difficult for the Americans. However, at 10 a.m. on the second day of March, the convoy was spotted by an Allied Liberator. From the nearest base, 8 B-17s took off to attack, followed by another 20 that departed an hour later. Upon reaching the convoy's position, a furious dogfight broke out between the jets of both forces. As the B-17s battled in the skies against the Mitsubishi A-6M0s, a crew of Lockheed P-38 Lightnings appeared and found a clear path to the fighters. They flew over the water at an extremely low altitude and fired their machine guns at the convoy to destroy its defenses. Finally, when the rival was cornered, they dropped dozens of 450-kilogram bombs that crashed violently against several ships, beginning the slaughter. The attacks continued during the afternoon and even in the following 2 days, maintaining the same tactics, but with different levels of success. The Japanese ships continued their way as best they could, without large reinforcements, besieged and at the mercy of the Allied planes that did not stop attacking whenever they saw the opportunity. Little by little the convoy was divided or weakened due to casualties. One part returned to Rabaul, while another remained behind to rescue soldiers stranded at sea with the help of other Japanese ships and submarines. By the end of March 4th, the battle between the Allied air forces and the Japanese convoy was over. The new U.S. attack strategy was incredibly effective and brutal. In total, the American and Australian planes used 233,847 rounds of ammunition and dropped 271 500-pound bombs and 253 1,000-pound bombs. For Japan, the mission was a resounding and costly failure that began the campaign for New Guinea in a fatal way. Although they knew that an adverse outcome was more than possible, the scale of the Allied attack took them by surprise. Of the 6,900 soldiers who were going to Laos, only 1,200 arrived. Another 2,700 were rescued from the sea and sent back to Rabaul. The remainder, nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors, died in the attack, more than the Americans killed at Pearl Harbor. However, the human losses were not the only ones for Japan. Of the 8 destroyers that departed for New Guinea, half were sunk, while the 8 transport ships were totally pulverized by enemy aircraft. Simultaneously, in the sky, 20 fighters were shot down. On the other hand, U.S. casualties were minimal. 2 bombers, 4 fighters and 13 killed, making the Bismarck Sea battle one of the most lopsided in all of World War II. Although the Allied media exaggerated the dimensions of the victory, going so far as to say that 15,000 enemy soldiers and more than 100 planes perished in the battle, the truth is that the defeat was extremely hard for Japan. The effectiveness of their enemies in attacking the convoy made it clear that they could not attempt another such mission and made it more difficult to move equipment and supplies by sea. The campaign for the strategic territory of New Guinea had just begun. And now, we come to the end of the video and we want to ask you, what was the main cause of the brutal Allied victory, the change of strategy for the bombing or the lack of preventive measures by Japan? Leave your answer in the comment box below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history. Thank you very much for joining us until the end. And stay tuned for our next video.